By 2006, Baghdad was the most dangerous city on earth, and the British were fighting a war in it that almost no one at home knew about. Every night, in the dark, a small group of men went out into the city to hunt the network that was tearing Iraq apart with car bombs and beheadings. They worked out of a base the Americans ran. They took their targeting from an American intelligence machine that General Stanley McChrystal had built into the most ruthless manhunting operation in modern military history. And night after night they kicked in doors, cleared rooms, and came back before dawn to do it again. The Americans called their part of it Task Force 145. The British squadron inside it had its own name, Task Force Black. They were SAS and a handful of attached support, and over 5 years in that city they conducted hundreds of operations and lost some of their best men. This is the story of the secret war the SAS fought in Baghdad, and what the Americans who fought beside them said when it was over. Start with a problem of the record. Britain does not confirm what its special forces do. The Ministry of Defence does not comment on the Special Air Service, has never published an account of Task Force Black. And almost everything in this story is secondary. The standard public source is a single book, Mark Urban's Task Force Black, published in 2010, catalogued by the Imperial War Museum as the reference work on the subject. The American side comes from General Stanley McChrystal's memoir, My Share of the Task, from 2013, and from Sean Naylor's History of American Special Operations, Relentless Strike, from 2015. Those are the documents. Much of the rest remains classified. Urban and the others are the public record. They are not the whole story. Say that plainly, because the gaps in this account are not failures of research. They are the point. Begin where the regiment began, in the wrong war. In the spring of 2003, the SAS went into Iraq to do the things the SAS had always done: deep reconnaissance, airfield seizures. On Operation Roe in March, squadrons captured air bases in the Western Desert with no losses. It was a conventional invasion, and the regiment played a conventional special forces part in it. And then the invasion ended, the statues came down, and the actual war started. It did not look like the one they had trained for. The enemy was not an army, it was a network. Car bombs in markets, suicide vests in police queues. A leadership that hid inside a civilian city of millions and regenerated faster than anyone could find it. By 2004 and 2005, it was clear that the real fight was the insurgency, and that the tools the coalition had brought were the wrong tools. And it was clear that the Americans were building something new to fight it. The documentary record establishes only this: that the man building it was Stanley McChrystal, and that what he built changed how the regiment fought. McChrystal commanded the American Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC, from 2003 to 2008. He inherited the most capable units the United States had: Delta Force, the Navy's SEAL Team 6, the Rangers. And he decided they were being wasted. The problem, as he saw it, was speed. An insurgent network heals. You take a man off the street tonight, and by the time you have worked out who he is and who he answers to, the network has already closed the wound and moved on. So McChrystal compressed the cycle. He fused the people who found the targets with the people who hit them, and the people who worked out what the raid had captured. And he put them in one room. The cycle had a name: find, fix, finish, exploit, analyze. Find the target, fix it in place, finish the raid. Exploit what you seize: the phones, the documents, the detainees.
Analyze it fast enough that it points you at the next door before the night is over.
Urban describes the ambition simply. McChrystal wanted to take down the enemy faster than it could regenerate. That is the machine the British squadron plugged into. The American umbrella was Task Force 145. It had 4 hunting arms, 1 drawn from SEAL Team 6, 1 from a Delta squadron, 1 from the Rangers, and 1 British, a single SAS Sabre squadron, with attached men from the Special Boat Service, the Special Reconnaissance Regiment, signallers from 18 Signals Regiment, and a company from the Special Forces Support Group. The Americans gave the British slice a colour, the way they coloured all the others. Task Force Black. Later, after the name leaked to the press following an incident at a prison in Basra in 2005, it was renamed Task Force Night. The British codename for the whole commitment was Operation Crichton.
The squadron worked out of a compound in the Baghdad Green Zone that everyone simply called the station. On the record, the Americans said one thing: off it, the files stay closed. So hold the precise claims lightly and the structure firmly. A British squadron inside an American machine in the worst city on earth, every night in the dark. What did a night actually look like? This is where the brief's temptation lives, and where this account refuses it. Other tellings of this story reconstruct the scene, invent the operator, write the dialogue, put words in a dead man's mouth. This one will not. The single most famous SAS in Iraq book before this, Andy McNabb's Bravo 20, was later taken apart by other men who had been there, as mostly invention. The lesson held. So here is only what the record supports. By the summer of 2005, the wider Task Force 145, all 4 arms together, was running on the order of 300 raids a month. The British squadron's own tempo is documented by McChrystal himself, who recorded that a squadron of 22 SAS, during one 6-month tour as part of Task Force Black and Night, carried out 175 combat missions. That is roughly a mission a night for half a year by one squadron. Multiply that across rotations and across years, and you have the hundreds of operations the Hook describes. The relentlessness was the weapon. The purpose of dropping from helicopters and going through doors in the dark was not the door, it was the next door. Each raid was a question the next raid answered. The men carried back phones and laptops and notebooks, and the analysts read them while the assault teams cleaned weapons. And by the following night, there was a new address. The conversation, reviewing the campaign years later, put the point exactly. The reason for kicking down doors each night was to find the intelligence for the next raid. That is what made this different from anything the regiment had done before. It was not a series of operations, it was an industrial process, and the squadron was one set of hands inside it. Accounts diverge on this point, on how much of the result belonged to the British and how much to the machine they were part of. Hold both. Take the hard cases. In April 2006, near a town called Yusufia, in the belt of country south of Baghdad that the soldiers called the Triangle of Death, B Squadron and the supporting paratroopers ran an operation the records call Larchwood 4. They struck at Al-Qaeda's leadership in the area. They took casualties, 3 SAS wounded in the documented account, and they took prisoners, and they took material. And the intelligence that came off that operation is widely reported to have fed the chain that ended 2 months later, on the 7th of June 2006, when American jets put 2 500-pound bombs onto a safe house northeast of Baghdad and removed Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the founder of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. the man behind the car bombs and the beheadings, the single most wanted figure in the country. The precise causal line from one raid to that bomb is a claim, not a closed fact. It rests on participant accounts, and the men who would know have not opened the files. But the British role in the long hunt that ran him down is part of the public record. Not every operation was a door in the dark. In July 2005, in an action the records call Operation Marlborough, British snipers took up positions overlooking a Baghdad street, where intelligence said a cell of suicide bombers was preparing to move against the green zone, and stopped 3 of them before they could reach their targets. It was a different kind of work to the night raids, patient, static, a long wait and a short result. But it ran on the same fuel: find the target, fix it, finish it. The intelligence came from the same machine, and the men who used it were the same squadron. That was the texture of the war. Not a single famous battle, but a continuous, varied, grinding application of the same cycle, every night and many days, against an enemy that never stopped producing new targets. Then there was the operation that almost no one expected the regiment to be remembered for. In late 2005, 4 peace activists with the Christian peacemaker teams were taken hostage in Baghdad. One of them, the American Tom Fox, was found dead. The other 3 included a British retiree named Norman Kember. For months, the squadron, in an effort recorded as Operation Lightwater, ground through the network holding them. Something like 50 building raids, 44 of them by British forces, 47 men detained. Until a detainee gave up an address. At 8 in the morning on the 23rd of March 2006, the assault force went in. The captors were gone. The hostages were there, bound, alive. Not a shot was fired. The American spokesman, Major General Rick Lynch, confirmed the details to the press, and then used the rescue, pointedly, to push back against the stories of prisoner mistreatment that had been dogging the task force for months. Which brings the account to the part the heroic version leaves out. Because the same machine that ran Larchwood and Lightwater also ran something darker, and an honest telling has to hold it. The task force did its interrogation at a facility near Baghdad airport called Camp Nama. From 2003 into 2006, American personnel and Iraqi detainees described serious mistreatment there. Beatings, extreme cold, stress positions, threats. The New York Times in 2006 reported that prisoners at Camp Nama, in its words, often disappeared into a detention black hole, barred from access to lawyers or relatives, and confined for weeks without charges. The Red Cross was kept out. An internal inquiry found cause. Of 29 complaints investigated, 5 were upheld, and dozens of soldiers were disciplined. McChrystal himself is credited with shutting down the worst of that regime in the spring of 2004 and building a cleaner intelligence centre at Baghdad. The British connection is the uncomfortable part, and the part the record cannot close. There is reporting that British personnel witnessed mistreatment and complained, and that little was done. How far any of that reaches into the British squadron is not in the public domain. It is one of the files that stays shut. The documentary record establishes only this, that the campaign was effective, that the campaign was contested, and that both of those are true at once. Here is the contest in numbers. The most quoted figure for what Task Force Black achieved comes from the journalist Sean Raymond, writing in The Telegraph, that the squadron removed or took down around 3,500 insurgents in Baghdad, and that car bombings in the city fell from roughly 150 a month to about 2. Treat that figure the way the evidence demands. It is a single journalist's reporting. It blends men detained with men taken down. And it credits one squadron with a fall in violence that also owed a great deal to the American surge of 2007, to the Sunni tribal awakening, and to the whole weight of the coalition. The squadron was one cause among several. The number is a claim. Attribute it and do not pretend it is a ledger. And there is a harder argument still, the one that runs the other way. Some analysts now look at the mass detention that the night raids produced, the prisons that filled, the camp at Bukka that at one point held some 24,000 men, and argue that the very relentlessness that broke Al-Qaeda in 2007 also hardened a generation of prisoners, and that out of those prisons came the leadership of the movement that would later call itself Islamic State. That is an interpretation, not a verdict. It is genuinely disputed. But a forensic account names it, because the men who fought this campaign were instruments of a strategy whose long results are still being argued over. Now, the cost. This is where the British public's ignorance was nearly total, and where the record is, for once, precise, because the dead have official notices. The first to fall was not strictly SAS. He was Corporal Ian Plank, a Royal Marine of the Special Boat Service attached to an SAS operation on the 31st of October 2003 in Ramadi. He was 31, from Poole. He was clearing a house, looking for a Sudanese facilitator, funneling fighters into Iraq, when the assault team was hit. He was the first member of UK Special Forces to fall in the Iraq War. 3 years later, on the 23rd of November 2006, Sergeant John Hollingsworth died of wounds taken on a raid to detain insurgents in Basra. He held the Conspicuous Gallantry Cross and the Queen's Gallantry Medal. The Defence Secretary, Des Brown, said of him, in the bare official language the families are given, that his death was a terrible loss and that he did not die in vain. That, and a few lines, is what the public was told. Then Baghdad took 2 more. On the night of the 5th into the 6th of September 2007, an SAS team went into a house in the city believed to hold a senior Al-Qaeda figure. Sergeant Eddie Collins, 33, from Milford Haven, a paratrooper serving with the regiment, was shot leading his men. And on the 26th of March 2008, Sergeant Nick Brown of 22 SAS, 34 years old, was shot in a firefight in Baghdad while part of a snatch squad sent after a militia commander. He was the last British combat fatality of the entire Iraq War. His father, himself a former member of the regiment, would later say he was blocked from asking the questions he wanted answered about the raid. There were others. 2 men are reported lost in a helicopter crash at Salman Pak in November 2007, less fully documented. The figure that recurs across the secondary sources is 6 SAS dead and around 30 wounded. But even that round number is contested because it counts across different strands of UK Special Forces and different windows of the war, and the precise tally, like so much else here, is not officially confirmed. Set that against the public number. Across the whole of Operation Telic, the British campaign in Iraq, 179 British personnel died, 136 of them to hostile action. That total was reported, debated, mourned. The squadron's handful of dead were folded into it without comment. And the country that argued so bitterly about the war never learned that inside it, a few dozen men were going out every night in the dark, and that some of them did not come back. The men who knew what they had done could not say so. So it fell to the Americans to say it for them. And this is the part the brief is built around, because it is the rare moment when the record speaks out loud. On the record, the Americans said one thing, and for once, what they said is on the record in full. In 2008, General David Petraeus, the American commander of all coalition forces in Iraq, sat down with the Times in his office in the Baghdad Green Zone and talked about the British squadron. He said this: "They have exceptional initiative, exceptional skill, exceptional courage, and, I think, exceptional savvy. I can't say enough about how impressive they are in thinking on their feet." And he said what they had actually done, that the SAS had helped immensely in the Baghdad area, in particular to take down the Al-Qaeda car bomb networks, and that they had done a phenomenal job in that regard. This is the most senior American commander in the theatre, speaking on the record, naming the contribution and rating it at the top. He was not alone. The British General Sir Robert Fry described the role of British Special Forces in defeating Al-Qaeda in Iraq as being, in his phrase, of an absolutely historic scale. And McChrystal, who had built the machine and watched the British arm of it work, recorded the squadron's tempo with the respect of a man who counts. That 175 missions in 6 months, and integrated the British so completely into his own command that by the middle of the war, the distinction between the American hunt and the British one had largely dissolved. That was the verdict that mattered. Not a medal, not a parade. The judgment of the toughest professional audience the regiment could possibly face. American Special Operations, the people who do nothing else, delivered plainly, in public, by name. This is not a prosecution, it is a case file, and the file's conclusion is narrow and large at the same time. Narrow because almost everything operational about Task Force Black remains sealed, and the figures are contested, and the strategy's long shadow is still argued over. Large because the one thing that did get said out loud was the thing that mattered most to the regiment's future. There is a detail in this worth holding on to, because it is the human root of the whole partnership. McChrystal had not met the British in Baghdad as strangers. His working relationship with the regiment reached back to the First Gulf War in 1991, where, as a younger officer, he had served alongside British Special Forces. And that older acquaintance is part of why the integration in Iraq went as far as it did. Sean Naylor's history of the command, Relentless Strike, traces how completely the British arm was folded in, not as a visiting ally on a separate task, but as a hunting arm of the same machine, taking targeting from the same fusion of intelligence and assault every night on the same cycle. By the middle years of the war, the line between the American hunt and the British one had, in practical terms, largely dissolved. Because here is the through line. The SAS came out of the Cold War with a reputation. But reputations need renewing. And the audience that could renew or ruin this one was not the British public, who barely knew the squadron was at war. It was the Americans. After 2001, American Special Operations became the center of gravity of the entire Western Special Forces world. And the question for every Allied unit was simple and brutal. Are you good enough to be let inside? Baghdad was where the SAS answered it. Not in one famous raid. In 5 years of relentless, unglamorous, deadly nights, inside the most demanding manhunting operation the Americans had ever run. The regiment proved it belonged at the same table as Delta and SEAL Team 6. The modern Anglo-American Special Forces relationship, the one that has run through every campaign since, was substantially welded together in that city, in the dark, raid after raid. That is the legacy, not the body count, the trust. And it was paid for the way everything in this story was paid for. Quietly, by a small number of men, in a war the public was arguing about for entirely different reasons. The British public spent the 2000s arguing about whether the Iraq War should ever have happened. Almost none of them knew that, in the worst years, a single SAS squadron was going out into Baghdad every night, plugged into the most lethal man-hunting machine the Americans had ever built, and that it was paying for that war in its own dead. The men who fought beside them, the Delta operators, the JSOC commanders, General McChrystal himself, said afterwards on the record that the British were among the finest soldiers they had ever worked with. It is one of the few verdicts on that war that almost no one in Britain ever heard. The squadron came home quietly, the way it had gone out. Most of the country never knew it had been away.